It happens in silence, long before the act, long before the victim, long before the crime makes sense to anyone watching from the outside. A line is crossed in the mind, not with fear or hesitation, but with relief. The most disturbing part is this: in that moment, the person doesn't feel evil at all. Before we go any deeper, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always want to know how far these stories travel. When people imagine criminals, they imagine guilt as inevitable, like a shadow that follows every immoral act. They assume that doing harm must feel heavy, corrupting, unbearable. This belief is comforting because it separates us from them. If evil feels bad, then anyone who does evil must be broken, monstrous, or in constant psychological pain. But real criminal psychology doesn't work that way. Most people who commit serious harm do not experience themselves as villains. They experience themselves as justified. Justification is not an excuse after the fact. It is a psychological process that begins before the crime and continues long after. It is the mind's way of protecting identity, because the human brain cannot tolerate seeing itself as bad for long. We can feel guilty temporarily, but sustained guilt threatens the core self-concept, and when identity is threatened, the mind adapts. Not by stopping the behavior, but by changing the story. This is where moral disengagement begins. Moral disengagement is not a single thought. It is a system, a layered psychological architecture that allows people to violate their own values without feeling like they've done anything wrong. It doesn't erase morality, it reroutes it. It bends moral rules so they apply to everyone except the self. And once this system is active, actions that would horrify others feel neutral, necessary, or even righteous. One of the earliest shifts happens in language. Harm is rarely framed as harm. Words soften reality. Violence becomes discipline. Theft becomes survival. Exploitation becomes opportunity. Abuse becomes honesty. This is not accidental. Language shapes perception. When you rename an act, you change how it feels to commit it. And when something feels different, it becomes easier to repeat. Criminals don't say, "I hurt someone." They say they deserved it, or "I had no choice," or "that's just how things are." These phrases are not rationalizations spoken aloud for others. They are internal scripts repeated until they feel true. The brain believes what it hears often enough, especially when believing it reduces psychological pain. Another critical mechanism is displacement of responsibility. Responsibility is heavy. It implies agency. So the mind moves it elsewhere, to circumstances, to authority, to necessity, to fate. I was following orders. I was pushed into it. Anyone in my position would have done the same. Responsibility dissolves into inevitability. And when something feels inevitable, guilt loses its grip. What's unsettling is how common this process is. You don't need to be a criminal to use it. People disengage morally every day in small ways. Cutting in line, lying to avoid consequences, exploiting someone's kindness. The difference with criminals is scale, repetition, and escalation. Small disengagements build tolerance. Tolerance builds confidence. Confidence builds justification. And justification builds permission. Another powerful tool is dehumanization. It is much harder to harm someone you fully perceive as human. So the mind reduces them, labels them, stereotypes them, turns them into symbols rather than individuals. Once a person becomes an object, empathy fades. This is why violent offenders often describe victims in abstract terms, not as people with inner lives, but as obstacles, threats, annoyances, or symbols of something they hate or resent. Dehumanization doesn't always look extreme. Sometimes it's subtle. Seeing someone as weak, as inferior, as less intelligent, as disposable. These are not emotional outbursts. They are cognitive shortcuts. And once those shortcuts are established, harm feels less like cruelty and more like correction. Then there is comparison. Humans judge morality relatively, not absolutely. So the mind searches for worse examples. At least, I didn't kill them. Others have done far worse. What I did is nothing compared to this. Comparative framing shrinks the perceived severity of the act. And because morality is framed socially, not internally, feeling better than someone else becomes more important than being good. This is why criminals often obsess over hierarchy. Who is worse? Who is weaker? Who deserves what? Hierarchy protects the ego. If you're not at the bottom, you're not the villain. You're just playing the game. Another mechanism is moral licensing. This is where past good behavior is used as credit for future harm. I've suffered enough. I've done good things too. I'm not a bad person overall. The mind keeps a mental balance sheet, and once the balance feels positive, harmful actions feel permitted. This is especially common in people who see themselves as victims. Suffering becomes a moral currency. Pain becomes permission. Victimhood is one of the most powerful justifications available. If you believe you've been wronged, then retaliation feels fair. If you believe the world owes you, then taking feels earned. This doesn't require the belief to be objectively true. It only needs to feel true. And once someone identifies as a victim deeply enough, almost any action can be reframed as self-defense. What's important to understand is that these processes are not conscious decisions most of the time. They are automatic, protective. The mind is not asking, "Is this right?" It's asking, "How do I live with myself?" And the fastest way to live with yourself is not to change behavior, but to change interpretation. As crimes escalate, the justifications evolve. Early on, the person may still feel flashes of discomfort, a brief pang of guilt, a moment of doubt. But instead of stopping, they analyze the discomfort. They interpret it as weakness, as conditioning, as something to overcome. Over time, the discomfort fades, not because the behavior becomes moral, but because the mind stops sending warning signals it believes will be ignored. This is how conscience dulls, not through corruption, but through neglect. Social reinforcement accelerates everything. When harmful beliefs are shared, they feel validated. Groups normalize behavior that individuals might hesitate to do alone. This is why criminal networks, gangs, extremist groups, and abusive communities are so effective. They provide moral cover. If everyone agrees, doubt disappears. Morality becomes group-defined, and leaving the group feels more immoral than harming outsiders. At this point, guilt doesn't vanish. It transforms. It turns outward. Instead of, "I did something wrong," it becomes, "You made me do this," or "This is your fault," or "If you hadn't done that, none of this would have happened." Guilt becomes blame, and blame is energizing. It fuels anger, entitlement, and further harm. This is why confronting criminals with logic or morality often fails. You're not arguing with ignorance. You're challenging a psychological defense system designed to protect identity at all costs. Attacking the behavior feels like attacking the self, and when the self is threatened, defenses intensify. But this raises an unsettling question. If justification is so powerful, why does guilt ever return? Why do some criminals break down years later? Why do confessions happen? Why do some people suddenly collapse under the weight of what they've done? The answer is that moral disengagement is not invincible. It is stable only as long as the identity it protects remains intact. When identity collapses, justification collapses with it. Guilt does not return gently. When it comes back, it does not knock. It breaks in. And that is precisely why the mind works so hard to keep it out for as long as possible. Moral disengagement is not a permanent state. It is a maintenance-heavy illusion. It requires constant reinforcement, repetition, and protection from anything that might destabilize it. For some individuals, that illusion lasts a lifetime. For others, it fractures suddenly, often at the moment they least expect it. The return of guilt almost never happens at the scene of the crime. That moment is too loud, too chaotic, too charged with adrenaline and self-protection. Guilt needs quiet. It needs space. It needs time for the nervous system to slow down enough for reflection to occur. This is why guilt often emerges years later in environments that strip away stimulation and control. Prison cells, hospital rooms, old age, solitude. When the external noise fades, the internal narrative becomes harder to suppress. One of the most important triggers for guilt is identity collapse. As long as a person can maintain a coherent self-story, hero, survivor, provider, avenger, misunderstood, victim, justification holds, but when that story fractures, guilt floods in. Identity collapse can be triggered by loss of status, loss of power, or loss of relevance. A criminal who once felt feared, respected, or necessary may eventually feel invisible, weak, or obsolete. And when the identity that justified harm no longer exists, the harm has nowhere to hide. This is why some offenders appear remorseful only after they are no longer dangerous. It's not that guilt suddenly appears because they've changed morally. It appears because the psychological structure that protected them has failed. Power loss is destabilizing, control loss is destabilizing, and guilt thrives in destabilization. Another major factor is narrative exhaustion. Justifications require repetition. They need to be rehearsed internally and reinforced externally. Over time, especially in isolation, those narratives can lose emotional charge. They begin to sound hollow, mechanical, repetitive. The mind gets tired of lying to itself, not because it wants truth, but because maintaining false coherence is cognitively expensive. When the narrative weakens, suppressed emotions surface. Memory plays a crucial role here. Traumatic memories are often fragmented and suppressed during periods of intense justification. But as defenses weaken, memories reorganize. Events are recalled with new emotional context. A face that was once an object becomes a person. A moment that felt justified becomes grotesque. This recontextualization is psychologically brutal. The brain is not just remembering the act, it is re-feeling it without the protective lens that once dulled its impact. This is why delayed guilt is often more intense than immediate remorse. Immediate remorse is reactive. Delayed guilt is reflective. It involves the integration of meaning, identity, and consequence. The person is not just thinking, "I did something bad." They are thinking, "This is who I chose to be," and that realization can shatter the self. Empathy returning is another destabilizing force. Empathy doesn't come back gradually, it returns in flashes. A smell, a sound, a story, a child's face. Something bypasses the cognitive defenses and activates the emotional brain directly. These moments are unpredictable and uncontrollable. And when empathy returns, it brings guilt with it, because empathy makes harm personal again. However, empathy alone is not enough. Many criminals experience fleeting empathy and then suppress it again. What makes guilt stick is sustained identification with the victim's humanity. When the offender can no longer see the victim as an abstraction, symbol, or obstacle, the moral disengagement collapses. The mind loses its ability to separate what I did from who I did it to. Social mirrors are another powerful catalyst. Being seen accurately by someone else can disrupt self-deception. This doesn't happen through accusation or condemnation. It happens through recognition. When someone reflects back a version of the self that aligns with suppressed truth, dissonance becomes unbearable. This is why some confessions happen in therapeutic settings rather than interrogations. Safety allows truth to surface. Threat reinforces defense, but not everyone reaches this point. Some individuals never experience guilt in a meaningful way, not because they are biologically incapable, but because their identity never collapses. They remain embedded in narratives that justify their behavior until the end. They die protected by belief. This is especially common in individuals whose harm was ideologically framed, socially rewarded, or structurally normalized. When harm is seen as duty, necessity, or destiny, guilt has no foothold. There is also a subset of individuals whose psychological development never fully integrated guilt as a regulatory emotion. In these cases, moral disengagement is not something they learned, it is something they never needed. Their emotional architecture prioritizes dominance, self-interest, or stimulation over relational concern. For them, guilt is not suppressed, it is simply irrelevant. These individuals are rare, but disproportionately represented in extreme violence. What separates those who eventually feel guilt from those who never do is not intelligence, not cruelty, the ability to reflect, to experience dissonance without immediately neutralizing it, and to tolerate emotional pain without externalizing it. Ironically, the capacity for guilt is a sign of psychological depth, and that depth is both a vulnerability and a pathway to accountability. When guilt finally takes hold, it often leads to one of two outcomes: repair or collapse. Repair involves acknowledgement, responsibility, and a reorientation toward values. This is rare and requires support, structure, and sustained effort. Collapse involves despair, self-loathing, and psychological shutdown. This is more common, especially when guilt arrives without tools for integration. The mind is flooded with meaning it cannot process. This distinction matters because guilt alone does not produce change. Guilt without responsibility leads to shame, and shame without agency leads to paralysis. True accountability requires both guilt and the belief that one can act differently going forward. Without that belief, guilt becomes destructive rather than corrective. Understanding when and why guilt returns helps dismantle another myth that punishment creates remorse. Punishment can create fear. It can create compliance. It can even create resentment, but it does not create guilt. Guilt arises internally when defenses fail and truth becomes unavoidable. External force cannot manufacture that moment. It can only create conditions where it might occur. This is why public shaming, humiliation, and moral grandstanding often backfire. They strengthen moral disengagement rather than weaken it. The individual retreats further into justification, seeing themselves as persecuted rather than responsible. Guilt cannot survive in a hostile environment.